Karen was having one of those days where everything seemed to go wrong. It was a busy afternoon, and the streets were crowded with people rushing to their destinations. Karen, a woman known for her fiery personality and short temper, was trying to make her way through the throngs of people. She had just left a store after a minor disagreement with a shop assistant and was already feeling frustrated. Her day wasn't going as planned, and she was desperate to get somewhere, anywhere, where she could escape the chaos. As she walked, her frustration began to build. The noise of the city, the people in her way, the endless things that seemed to irritate her. Everything felt like it was closing in on her. It wasn't long before she found herself near a part of the city where a royal palace stood. The grand architecture stood in stark contrast to the busy streets, but it wasn't the beauty of the palace that caught Karen's attention. It was the royal guard stationed in front of it. These guards were known for their stoic, serious demeanor, standing perfectly still for hours, with eyes locked forward. They wore their traditional uniforms, their presence commanding respect. But today, Karen wasn't feeling respectful. She wasn't in the mood for formality, and the guard's presence irritated her further. She wanted to walk past, but the guard had stationed himself at a narrow entrance, blocking her path. Karen, feeling more and more annoyed with every passing second, approached the guard. She tried to squeeze by, but he didn't move. It wasn't that he was trying to stop her. It was simply his job to stand his ground. He was doing what he was trained to do, but to Karen, it felt like an obstacle. She couldn't stand the idea of being told where she could go or what she could do. She had been through enough that day, and she wasn't about to let some guard get in her way. "Excuse me," she said, a bit too loudly, expecting the guard to step aside. But he didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still, eyes forward, unmoving. That's when her frustration boiled over. She felt as though she was being disrespected, that the world was against her, and in that moment, she made a rash decision. In a split second, Karen's hand reached into her bag, pulling out a small can of pepper spray. Without thinking, she aimed it directly at the guard and pressed down. The spray hit its mark. For a brief moment, everything was still, and Karen felt a rush of satisfaction, as if she had gained the upper hand. But that feeling quickly disappeared. As soon as the spray left the can, a sinking feeling took over her. She had done something she could never take back. Instantly, Karen realized her mistake. She had just pepper-sprayed a royal guard. She hadn't thought about the consequences, the legal trouble, or how serious her actions could be. Now, standing there, watching the guard's reaction, Karen was filled with regret. The satisfaction she once felt was replaced by the horrifying reality that she had done something terrible. She wasn't sure what to expect next, but she knew one thing for sure. This was going to be a moment she would never forget. The moment Karen pressed the can of pepper spray, time seemed to slow down. The spray hit the royal guard square in the face, and Karen stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. For a brief second, it felt like a small victory. She thought she had taken control of the situation, that she had made her point. But almost immediately, the guard's face twisted in discomfort, and a sharp sense of regret hit Karen like a wave. The guard didn't flinch or react aggressively, as she had expected. Instead, his hand moved swiftly to his belt, pressing a small button that seemed to activate a silent alarm. The sound was faint, but enough to make Karen's stomach drop. Her heart raced as she realized the magnitude of her action. This wasn't just any ordinary situation. She had just pepper-sprayed a royal guard, someone who had authority, respect, and the backing of powerful figures. And now, Karen had made herself the center of attention, with all eyes around her slowly turning in her direction. The guard remained calm, despite the burning sensation that was no doubt spreading across his face. His expression was a mix of surprise and annoyance. But there was no anger. He was trained to handle moments like this. Karen, however, was no longer calm. She stood there, her hands trembling as she tried to figure out what to do next. Should she apologize? Run? Pretend it never happened? But no apology could undo the damage. The realization hit her hard. There were cameras around, people watching, and most likely, security personnel nearby who would be alerted to the situation. It didn't matter that she hadn't intended for things to go this far. She had crossed a line. Within moments, the guard's colleagues appeared, moving quickly toward Karen. Their presence only made her more anxious. She was surrounded, and there was no escape from the consequences of what she had done. One of the guards walked up to her, his voice steady but firm. "You need to come with us," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was still in shock. Her mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. The guard who had been sprayed was now stepping back, and Karen could see that he was wiping his face, his eyes red but still focused. It wasn't long before other guards appeared on the scene, their stern faces adding to the gravity of the situation. Karen knew she was in deep trouble now. All the anger and frustration she had felt moments earlier were gone, replaced by a heavy sense of regret. She wanted to take back everything, to rewind time and handle the situation differently. But it was too late. Karen could see the onlookers, some of whom were shaking their heads, others whispering amongst themselves. They had witnessed her act, and now she would have to face the consequences. Her heart sank as she realized how badly she had misjudged the situation. What she thought would be a small act of defiance had now spiraled into something far worse. It was too late to fix it, and in that moment, Karen knew she would have to face whatever was coming next. As the guards moved in, Karen's mind raced. She had never imagined something so simple would spiral out of control so quickly. Her hands shook, and her throat felt dry as she stood there, trying to find the right words. But no words came. She had made a mistake, and now the situation was far more serious than she could have ever anticipated. The guard who had been sprayed was now wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, clearly uncomfortable. Karen could see that he was struggling with the effects of the pepper spray, but despite the discomfort, he maintained his composure. He didn't shout, didn't lash out. He simply moved with professionalism, even as his face reddened and his eyes watered. Karen's heart sank even further. This wasn't a petty confrontation anymore. This was a real, serious situation. "Come with us," one of the guards said again, this time more sternly. He was a few steps away from Karen. His eyes locked on her with an intensity that made her stomach twist. She wanted to say something, anything, that would make the moment better, but nothing felt right. She had never been in trouble like this before. This wasn't a minor argument with a shopkeeper or a disagreement with a stranger. This was real, and she could feel it in the weight of the guard's presence. Without another word, Karen reluctantly began to follow the guards. The people around her didn't speak, but their eyes followed her every move. She could hear hushed whispers behind her, some curious, others disapproving. She wanted to hide, to disappear, but that wasn't possible now. She couldn't run from what she had done. The guards led her toward a small security office, tucked away from the busy street. As they walked, Karen's mind continued to race. She thought about her actions, the rash decision that had led her to this point. Why had she done it? Why hadn't she just walked away? The frustration and anger she had felt earlier seemed so insignificant now. Now, all she could think about was how foolish she had been, and how much worse it could get. Once inside the security office, the atmosphere was cold and official. The guards told Karen to sit, and she did so, her hands still trembling in her lap. She felt small, exposed, and utterly out of place. One of the guards stepped outside to make a call, and the silence that followed felt heavy, almost suffocating. It was in that silence that Karen began to truly understand the gravity of what she had done. She had pepper-sprayed a royal guard, someone trained to handle tense situations with composure and respect. And now, there would be consequences. Karen's mind flashed back to the moment she had taken out the pepper spray. At the time, she had been so sure of herself, so convinced that she could control the situation. But now she realized how badly she had misjudged it. The regret was overwhelming, and the consequences of her rash decision were just beginning to unfold. She sat there, her head hung low, waiting for what would come next. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. Karen sat in the small, dimly lit security office, her heart still pounding in her chest. The silence around her felt unbearable, pressing in on her from all sides. The guard who had been sprayed was no longer in the room, but the memory of his face, scrunched in discomfort, kept replaying in her mind. What had she been thinking? What had possessed her to do something so impulsive? She couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had worked for, everything she had built, was slipping away in that very moment. As the minutes stretched on, Karen felt the weight of her situation becoming clearer. The guards hadn't said much, but she knew they were processing what had happened. She had disrespected an authority figure, one who was trained to handle difficult situations with dignity and professionalism. And for what? A moment of frustration that, in the grand scheme of things, meant nothing. She thought about how she had let a small, insignificant incident escalate into something far beyond her control. Just then, one of the guards entered the room again. This time, he had a stern look on his face, and Karen could sense the seriousness of the situation. He didn't speak immediately, but took a seat across from her. Karen felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had imagined this moment over and over in her mind, and now that it was happening, she wasn't sure she could bear it. "We need to talk about what happened," the guard said, his voice calm but firm. "Do you understand the seriousness of this situation?" Karen nodded, her throat dry. She couldn't look him in the eye, feeling small and ashamed. What could she say? There was no excuse for what she had done. She had acted without thinking, driven by frustration and impatience, and now she was facing the consequences. She wasn't sure if he expected an apology, but even if she said sorry, would it even make a difference? Could anything make it right? The guard continued, his tone unwavering. "You've assaulted a royal guard. That's a criminal offense. You need to understand the weight of this. It's not something we take lightly." Karen felt her stomach drop. Assault. The word echoed in her mind, and it was almost too much to process. She had never intended for things to go this far. It had all been an impulse, a poor decision made in a moment of irritation. But now, the consequences were real, and they were becoming harder to ignore. I didn't mean to," Karen began, but her voice faltered. The words didn't come easily, and she realized she had nothing to say that could undo what had been done. The guard wasn't interested in excuses. He was just doing his job, and he was right to do so. She had crossed a line, and there was no way to take it back. The guard's expression softened slightly, but there was no mistaking the seriousness of the situation. "This will be dealt with appropriately," he said, and Karen could hear the finality in his words. "But we need to know what led to this. What were you thinking?" Karen took a deep breath, trying to steady her shaking hands. She didn't know where to begin. How could she explain her behavior? How could she explain the frustration that had built up over the course of the day, the irritation that had led her to make such a reckless choice? She couldn't. There was no real reason for what she had done, and deep down she knew that. It had just been a terrible mistake. "I don't know," Karen finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I lost control." The guard didn't respond right away, and the silence between them stretched on. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but a heavy one, filled with the weight of her actions. Karen couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would she be arrested? Would she face criminal charges? She wasn't sure, but she knew that no matter what happened, this moment would be one she would never forget. As Karen sat in the small, sterile security room, the minutes felt like hours. Her thoughts raced, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The guard's words echoed in her mind, reminding her of the seriousness of the situation. She had assaulted a royal guard. Assault. The word alone was enough to make her stomach twist. How had it come to this? How had a simple walk down the street turned into a life-changing event? Outside the security office, Karen could hear the bustle of the city, the sounds of people going about their day, completely unaware of the chaos she had caused. She could picture the people on the street, whispering about her, watching the scene unfold. Word traveled quickly in a busy place like this, and she knew that the moment her face was seen by others, her reputation would be forever changed. She wasn't sure if the consequences would be immediate or if they would come later, but she could feel them closing in around her, like an unavoidable storm. Her mind wandered to her life before this moment. She had always been the type of person who acted first and thought later. It had gotten her into trouble before, but nothing like this. Nothing that could potentially ruin her life. She had made a mistake, a huge one. And now it seemed like it might cost her more than just a bit of embarrassment. It could cost her her freedom. Karen's thoughts were interrupted as the door opened again, and two more guards stepped inside. They looked at her with a mixture of professionalism and concern. She was acutely aware of their presence, the way their eyes seemed to analyze every move she made, every expression on her face. It felt as though they were evaluating her, trying to determine what kind of person she was. And for the first time in a long time, Karen wasn't sure who she was anymore. One of the guards spoke first, his voice calm but firm. "We need to take your statement now," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "What happened back there? Why did you do it?" Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She had no real answer to give. She didn't know why she had done it. She had let her emotions take control, and in that split second, she made a choice that now seemed absurd. Why hadn't she just walked away? Why hadn't she taken a deep breath, counted to 10, and found another way to deal with the situation? But she hadn't, and now she was paying the price. I don't know," Karen stammered, her voice shaky. "I was frustrated. I had a bad day, and The guard interrupted her, his tone slightly softer. "Frustration is understandable, but that doesn't excuse your actions. You could have handled it differently." Karen's cheeks burned with shame. He was right. She knew it. It wasn't just about being frustrated. It was about how she had chosen to react. And now, in this cold room, with the weight of her mistake heavy on her shoulders, she couldn't escape the truth. She had acted recklessly, and there were consequences. The guards were silent for a moment, watching her. Then, the one who had been speaking nodded. "We'll be filing a report on this. The situation will be reviewed, and we'll let you know the next steps." He paused, his eyes softening for just a moment. "We understand people make mistakes, but this is a serious matter." Karen could barely meet his gaze. She nodded slowly, barely hearing the words he was saying. All she could think about was how she had let her anger take over, how she had let a fleeting moment of frustration destroy her peace. She had made her own life so much harder, and now there was no going back. As the guards left the room, Karen was left alone again. The silence felt even heavier now. She sat there, her mind blank, trying to process everything. The consequences were coming. She knew that much. She didn't know what they would be, but she could feel them drawing closer with every passing second. And all she could do was wait. Karen sat in the small, windowless room, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Her mind was clouded with thoughts of regret, worry, and disbelief. She kept replaying the moment in her head, wishing she could go back in time and change her reaction. But it was impossible. What she had done was done. There was no taking it back. The only thing she could do now was wait and see how the situation would unfold. Outside, the sounds of the busy city continued, but inside the room, it was silent except for the occasional shuffle of footsteps outside the door. Karen could hear the faint hum of voices in the hallway, but they felt distant, as if they were happening in another world entirely. Her world was here, in this room, waiting for the next steps in what had turned into a nightmare. She tried to think of the worst-case scenario. Would she be arrested? Would there be charges pressed against her? Would she lose everything? The questions seemed endless, and the more she thought about them, the more she felt her anxiety grow. She knew she had made a terrible mistake, but how bad would the consequences be? Karen's mind shifted to the moment she had sprayed the guard. In her frustration, she hadn't stopped to think about what it would mean to attack someone in a position of authority, especially a royal guard. The realization hit her like a wave. It wasn't just a simple mistake. She had made a choice that could lead to serious legal trouble. The silence in the room was broken when the door opened again. This time, 2 officers entered the room. One of them was the guard who had been sprayed earlier. His face still looked slightly red, though it seemed like the discomfort had faded. The other officer was a tall man with a stern expression, his eyes sharp as he looked at Karen. She immediately felt a surge of fear. The weight of the situation had just become even more real. The tall officer spoke first. "We've reviewed the situation, and now we need to know more about why this happened." His voice was calm but firm, and it sent a shiver down Karen's spine. "You're being asked to explain your actions, and we need the full truth." Karen swallowed hard, her throat dry. She knew she couldn't hide behind excuses or attempt to downplay what had happened. The reality was too clear. She had reacted poorly, and now she had to face the consequences. "I was frustrated," Karen said, her voice shaky. "It was a bad day, and I didn't think before I acted. I felt trapped, and I lost control. I never meant to hurt anyone." Her words felt weak, and she could see in their eyes that they weren't enough. She didn't expect them to be. They weren't looking for an excuse. They were looking for accountability. The officer nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving her. "Frustration is understandable," he said, "but actions like these can't go unnoticed. Assaulting a royal guard is a serious matter, and it will be handled accordingly." Karen's stomach churned. She had hoped that, in some way, the situation could be fixed, but it was becoming clear that there was no easy way out. The guard, still standing by the door, finally spoke up, his voice quieter than before. "I understand that emotions can get the best of us sometimes, but what you did is not something we can overlook." Karen looked down at her hands, feeling the weight of her mistake bearing down on her. There was no one to blame but herself. She had acted in anger and impatience, and now she was paying the price. "We'll need to report this to the higher authorities," the tall officer continued. "The next steps will depend on the review of this incident, but rest assured, this is being taken seriously." He paused, his eyes softening just a little. "You should have thought about the consequences before acting, but now you'll need to face them." The door closed behind the officers as they left the room. Karen was left alone again, the reality of her actions sinking in even deeper. The regret she had been feeling earlier was now replaced by a sense of dread. She had made a huge mistake, and now she had no choice but to wait for the fallout. Would she face legal action? Would she be fined? What about her reputation? Everything seemed uncertain, but one thing was clear: her life was about to change, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The minutes dragged on, and Karen could only sit there, her thoughts a jumble of worry and regret. The situation was far from over, and she had no idea how it would end. All she could do was brace herself for whatever would come next. The silence in the small room felt almost suffocating as Karen sat alone, her thoughts swirling in a sea of uncertainty. She had been waiting for what felt like an eternity, but the moments stretched on, each one heavier than the last. Her mind kept replaying everything that had happened: the guard, the pepper spray, the realization of how far she had gone. She could still feel the rush of frustration, the impulsive need to act, but now, all that remained was a deep, overwhelming sense of regret. She had no idea what would happen next. Would she be arrested? Would she face a fine or worse? Karen wasn't sure, but she couldn't escape the reality that her rash decision had placed her in a situation she could no longer control. She thought about her family, her friends, and how this moment might change everything for her. What would they think? How could she explain what had happened? The idea of facing the world after this was almost too much to bear. Her mind wandered back to the first time she had acted on impulse. She was never one to let things slide, always quick to speak her mind, to fight for what she felt was right. But this time, it wasn't just a disagreement or a minor setback. It was something that had put her in real jeopardy. She had made a mistake, and now it felt like there was no way out. Suddenly, the door creaked open again. Karen's heart jumped in her chest as she looked up, half expecting the worst. 2 officers entered, this time with a more official demeanor. One of them was the same guard who had been affected by the spray earlier. His face had returned to normal, but his eyes still held a trace of discomfort from the experience. The other officer was someone Karen hadn't seen before, a tall woman with sharp features and an air of authority that made her presence impossible to ignore. The 2 officers exchanged a brief glance before the woman spoke. "Karen, we've reviewed your case, and we need to discuss the next steps," she said. Her tone was firm, yet not unkind, but it carried a weight that made Karen's stomach churn. "This is a serious matter, but it's also important for us to understand the full context of what led to your actions." Karen swallowed hard, her mouth dry. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was frustrated. I had a bad day, and I made a bad decision. I wasn't thinking." The officer nodded, her eyes studying Karen carefully. "We understand that emotions can sometimes cloud judgment, but there are consequences when we let those emotions guide our actions. You've assaulted a royal guard, and the law must take its course." She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle in. "That said, we also take into account your cooperation and understanding of the situation. You're not being treated as someone who intended harm, but the actions still speak for themselves." Karen's heart sank. She had hoped, in some small part of her mind, that maybe there was a way to escape the harsh reality. But the officer's words were clear. There would be consequences, and she would have to face them. "The guard you sprayed is fine now, and there were no lasting injuries," the officer continued. Karen could feel her pulse quicken as the words sank in. Legal action. What did that mean? Was she going to be arrested? Would she have to go to court? The unknowns were endless, and each one added to the weight of the situation. "Look," the officer said, her voice softening just slightly, "we can't change what's already been done, but we're giving you a chance to make things right. It's important that you reflect on what happened here and the impact it's had." Karen nodded, barely able to meet the officer's gaze. What else could she say? She had already admitted her mistake. She knew that no amount of apologies or explanations could change what had occurred, but at least she was being given the chance to own up to it. "We'll be in touch," the officer said, her tone still firm but not unkind. "For now, you're free to go, but please understand that the matter is not over. You'll be contacted about the next steps soon." Karen barely registered the door closing behind them as she sat back in her chair. The weight of the moment settled on her again, more heavily than before. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but at least she had faced the situation head-on. There were no easy answers, no simple fixes, but for the first time in a long time, she understood that actions had consequences, and those consequences were something she would have to live with. As she stood up and walked out of the room, Karen realized that this moment, this mistake, had forced her to see herself in a new light. She wasn't proud of what she had done, but she would learn from it. It was the only thing she could do. Karen stepped out of the security office, the door closing quietly behind her. The weight of the situation lingered, pressing heavily on her shoulders as she walked down the hallway. It was a strange feeling, like walking through a fog, not fully aware of where she was going or what would happen next. Her mind kept racing, still trying to process everything that had just transpired. The officer's words echoed in her mind, and though they had told her she was free to go for now, the uncertainty of the next steps made everything feel up in the air. The street outside was as busy as ever, people moving in all directions, their lives continuing on as if nothing had changed. But for Karen, everything had changed. The moment she had acted impulsively, spraying the royal guard, she had shifted her own life onto a different path. What had seemed like a small, angry decision in the moment had turned into something much bigger. She had thought of herself as someone who could handle anything, someone who didn't back down. But now, she felt like she had lost control. She walked slowly, her footsteps heavy, lost in thought. As she passed by the familiar shops, the faces of strangers blurred in her vision. She could almost feel their eyes on her, though she knew they didn't know what had happened. Still, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that everyone knew her mistake. The embarrassment was almost unbearable. It wasn't just about the pepper spray, though that was bad enough. It was about how foolish she had been. She had let her anger lead her, and now she had to live with it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat. It was a message from her best friend. "Hey, how did it go? Everything okay?" Karen paused for a moment, staring at the message. She could feel the weight of the lie on the tip of her tongue, but she couldn't bring herself to type anything other than the truth. "It wasn't good," Karen typed back. "I messed up. I really messed up." She hit send and then stared at the screen, waiting for a response. She knew her friend would be concerned, maybe even angry, but Karen couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. For the first time since the incident, she had spoken the truth without trying to sugarcoat it. The situation was bad, and there was no denying it anymore. The phone buzzed again, and Karen quickly opened the reply. "I'm so sorry. What happened? Do you want to talk about it?" Karen smiled faintly at her friend's words. Even though she had messed up, there was someone who cared enough to ask. That simple message, though small, reminded Karen that she wasn't completely alone. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew that she had to face the consequences of her actions. And maybe, just maybe, she would learn something from it. As Karen continued walking down the street, she reflected on the lessons she had learned that day. She knew she had acted impulsively, without thinking of the bigger picture. She had allowed her emotions to cloud her judgment, and it had cost her. But the hardest lesson, the one that was becoming clearer by the minute, was that mistakes weren't the end. They didn't define who you were. What mattered was how you learned from them. She would have to face the consequences of her actions, whatever they may be. And she had no illusions that it would be easy. But one thing was certain. She would never make the same mistake again. She would take a step back next time, breathe, and think before reacting. She had learned the hard way, but she had learned. By the time Karen reached her apartment, she had made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't let this mistake define her, and she wouldn't hide from the consequences. She would face them head-on and take responsibility for what she had done. And as she opened the door to her apartment, she knew it was the first step toward a new chapter in her life, one where she would be more thoughtful, more aware, and hopefully, a better version of herself. Karen sat down on her couch, her phone still in her hand, staring at the message from her friend. The weight in her chest had lightened just a little. Maybe it was because she had admitted the truth, or maybe because, despite everything, she still had people in her corner. Whatever it was, she knew she was ready to face whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but for the first time that day, Karen felt like she could handle whatever was coming her way.